Morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this week's PAVE panel. We're going to start very shortly. Just going to give a few seconds for folks to join here as we get started. As a reminder, you will be able to find the full recording of the panel as well as all of our previous virtual panels on our YouTube channel, on our website at pavecampaign.org, or on our social media channels at pavecampaign. All right, I think we can go ahead and get started as people continue trickling in here. Welcome to PAVE's 120th virtual panel. Today we are going to be talking about how legal frameworks and safety standards are shaping ADAS and AV development. My name is Caitlin Magny Miller. I'm PAVE's communications manager, and I'll be your moderator today. Let's take a moment to introduce our guests, and then we'll get started. Today, we are joined by Stephanie Leonard. She is the head of government and regulatory affairs at TomTom. Giovanni Giancaspro, he is the senior manager of product marketing at TomTom. And David Ward, he is the executive president at the Towards Zero Foundation and Global NCAP. So thank you all so much for joining us. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's start with you, Giovanni. Can you, many people in the audience are familiar with TomTom from your well-known GPS units. Can you talk a little bit about what TomTom is currently working on and specifically what you're focused on in the ADAS and AV space?
Yeah, that's a good question. At TomTom, still as a consumer unit, but our main focus today is providing location technology to automotive and enterprise businesses, which includes the large car manufacturers and big tech players. TomTom is one of the very few companies that builds a global map, and that can be used to power a variety of applications, which include navigation, routing, and driving automation, for example. Earlier this year, we have launched our next generation map platform, which is called Orbis, which embraces a fully collaborative approach to map making. Because we live at a time in which everything around us, including ourselves, produce data. And when you build map that needs to be fresh and accurate, this requires taking in a lot of data from a variety of sources. So this is what we do. And my focus specifically within TomTom is on solutions for assisted and automated driving.
Great. Now, David, can you tell us a bit about the Towards Zero Foundation and your work with Global NCAP?
Yeah, thanks. Well, Towards Zero Foundation is an international non-profit philanthropy. We're based in the UK, but we work internationally. And our largest single project is the Global New Car Assessment Program. And what that does is it's a platform for cooperation amongst all the new car assessment programs around the world. NCAPs started, in fact, in the US. The first ever one was launched back in the late 70s by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And the simple idea was to do independent consumer testing alongside regulation, usually at a more stringent level of testing. And this formula has worked incredibly well all around the world. So there are now 10 different NCAPs working across the world, typically rating the performance of vehicle safety, targeting consumers, but also trying to create a competitive environment for manufacturers to kind of show off the best they can do. Obviously, the higher rating they get a better score, they get ultimately better sales, and it's a kind of virtuous circle where it encourages manufacturers to do the best they can and consumers to buy the safest vehicle they can afford. And we in this work we promote both traditional crash worthiness, which is how vehicles perform in a crash, but also crash avoidance technologies, because far best not to have the crash at all. And as part of that, of course, ADAS technology is the kind of work that TomTom's involved in, is a critical component.
Great. And let's talk a little bit more about one specific ADAS feature, which is intelligent speed assistance. Giovanni, can you tell us a little bit about what that is and how it works?
Sure. So ISA is a system that is installed on board of the vehicle and that is tasked to determine the car speed limit at any moment of the journey. And it has to do at least two things. Number one, it has to inform the driver about a car speed limit by displaying this information on a screen which is easily visible, like, for example, the instrument cluster. And the second thing that it has to do, it has to warn the driver if the speed limit exceeds the correct one. And this could be done through a sound or haptic feedback. On top of this, ISA may or may not have a third component, which is a speed control function that automatically adjusts the speed limit to the correct one. This can be introduced in the design by car manufacturers, but for example, it is not mandated by the new ISA regulation that has been adopted in the European Union.
Thank you. And now, David, the European Union has made ISA mandatory on all new cars sold from July of 2024. Can you share some insight on what the key factors were that led to that decision, and also what impact ISA has had on road safety in Europe?
Yeah, it's a game-changing moment for ISA, this, because Europe is essentially the world's second largest vehicle market. So for it now to be mandated, not just for passenger cars, but across all vehicles, is a really, really significant change. It's part of a package of measures called the General Safety Regulation, which was adopted in 2019. So it includes other important ADAS systems like autonomous emergency braking, lane departure warning, and so on. Also has event data recorders. There's a whole range of things, some including crashworthiness improvements. And the sense in Europe which led to this was that there's been a substantial improvement in vehicle safety over the last 25 years in Europe. But the primary gains were occupant protection. And this was because in the late 1990s, early 2000s, new crash test standards came in for front and side impact, pole side impact, all sorts of things like this. And that massively improved, almost cut by half, the number of vehicle occupant deaths. But the concern was that that's not anything like good enough, because we're concerned about all the vulnerable road users too, and avoiding crashes. So the highlights of the GSR, the new package, are these ADAS systems. And speed, everybody knows that speed is a sort of central feature of almost any crash you have. I mean, almost in principle, any kind of crash at any speed, the less speed you have, the better, because if you like, you're reducing the load on the safety system if you have less speed. And we know that inappropriate speed, various studies have shown inappropriate speed is responsible for about up to 30% of fatal road crashes. That was a study by the International Transport Forum some years ago. NTSB in the US estimate that there's an increased risk likelihood of fatal or serious injury by up to 31%. Due to excessive speed. Another study, the IHS, Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, estimated that a quarter of fatal road crashes in the USA are attributed to speed. So that thinking really informed the decision making in the EU. In the run-up to the adoption in 2019. It was quite a long process. It took about 4 years, the whole legislative process. And an important part of this is that ISA was treated as part of the whole package of measures. There was a very elaborate cost-benefit study done to try and estimate the benefits that this package will deliver. You asked about, how is this affecting safety? It's a little too early to say because it's only just now coming in. But the estimate of the whole package is that it would reduce fatal injuries by 25,000 and 140,000 serious injuries by mid-2030s, which is a substantial gain to be had. So that's the aspiration. An important part of this is that ISA, they didn't treat ISA in isolation, because ISA is like a kind of supercharger for safety. It actually makes the other systems work better. So for instance, if you have autonomous emergency braking in a vehicle, if you also have ISA, then it's going to reduce the amount of speed that the other system has to deal with, hopefully avoiding the impact. But if you are having an impact, the amount of kinetic energy you have to deal with is reduced. So ISA is a kind of superpower in the safety technologies, which is why we're so excited about it being mandated in Europe, and we're seeing it spread Obviously, because of the mandate, it'll work through the whole new vehicle fleet. But there are some interesting examples already of progress. In London, not far from where I am now, the Transport for London, the main authority that deals with London public transport, they have rolled out an ISA fitment to their entire bus fleet. And they're about a third of the way through. But they have an ambition to have their entire bus fleet ISA equipped. And they've seen a huge reduction, about a 300% reduction in speeding incidents with their buses, with those equipped. And there are other examples of fleets like this benefiting from ISA. And of course, one of the exciting things about ISA more globally is that it does have the capacity to be retrofitted. So there are systems that you can do as aftermarket products. So there's a big potential here for fleet safety of all kinds, public and private, to use ISA technologies to better manage the safety of their fleets.
Great. Really some impactful statistics that you shared. Giovanni, I'm going to come back to you. Can you talk a little bit about why ISA is relevant for TomTom and how maps contribute to all of this?
Yes, of course. It is all about accuracy, right? A system like ISA has to be very accurate for at least two reasons. One, because in the European Union, where ISA adoption is regulated, the system has to perform above a certain accuracy threshold, which is set by the regulator. This is a very high accuracy requirement that needs the system to be correct at least 90% of the total distance covered. And two, because accuracy influences the trust that the driver is willing to put in the system. If you get the wrong reading too often, then the driver will also lose trust in the ISA system. In order to achieve this high accuracy, the vast majority of car manufacturers adopted an hybrid camera image recognition plus map solution. And the cameras can, of course, recognize speed restriction signs, but they can't do it all the times. First of all, because the vast majority of speed restrictions are not marked by road signs. In Europe, for example, we're talking about up to 60% of the speed restrictions are considered implicit, which means that there is a standard speed for a road category, but there's not necessarily a sign there that can be picked up by a camera. And besides, even when the sign is there, the camera may not be able to read it correctly because of bad weather condition, because of the light is not ideal, because the sign could be obstructed for the camera, or the lens could be dirty, and so on. There's a variety of reasons why the performance of the camera alone may not be able to achieve that accuracy threshold, which is set by the regulator. And an underlying map then has a key function, as it helps to validate the camera readings and to increase the overall accuracy and reliability of the system. And this is why ISA is relevant for TomTom. And thanks to a map, then the technology can go beyond the range and the performance of what the camera alone can deliver.
Great. So David, how have OEMs adapted to these ISA regulations in the EU, and how does it compare to some of the other ADAS regulations that have happened?
Well, that's interesting. Let's say there was a certain amount of division amongst the main manufacturers. In the run-up during the legislative process, some manufacturers were actually fighting to have ISA not included. And it was kind of predictable. It was the manufacturers that trade a lot on speed and performance of vehicles. And there was quite a struggle with them. And they tended, we think, to exaggerate problems of the level of compliance. And we argued with them quite vehemently about this, because nobody expects every technology to be 100% foolproof. In fact, there was a hearing in the European Parliament, and the guy from the European Car Manufacturers Association, who happened to be from BMW, and you kind of get the point about performance vehicles, and they were talking about the potential failures and the confusion and irritation this might cause. And so I said to them, well, that's fine. Let's see if you would come with me to a room of people who've been involved in road traffic fatalities, injuries, parents, let's say, and we'll explain to them there's a technology that we think is maybe 90%, maybe 95% effective, but you don't think it's ready for regulation. You explain to those bereaved families that they don't think this regulation should be applied. And it was very interesting to see how their arguments dissolved rather quickly when you put it in that context. But the reality is that there is a regulation now, so they're all having to adjust to it. There is flexibility in the EU regulation. There are 4 different options of how manufacturers can apply the technology, from just acoustic sound, a rising acoustic scale, to the full system where the vehicle will control the speed, although they're overridable. So I think there will be some adjustment in the marketplace to this. But what's most interesting, in my view, is that the experience we've seen with consumers who are actually using it is they quite like it. And it's not as much a concern as people think. That's my only experience. In fact, I had a retrofit ISA in a vehicle that I was using for 6 months last year, and it was a very, very simple, just GPS maps-based system produced by Sturdy IQ, and I found it incredibly relaxing. And the number of failures where it got the wrong speed, it was remarkably low, and in each case I could see what had happened. It didn't cause me any difficulties at all. So, and it's interesting, just recently, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety in the US has done a survey of drivers' opinions, with a 60% return saying that they would welcome ISA, because when you actually, in the day-to-day life of people, is they don't intend to speed. It's nearly always involuntary, and it just creates an extra stress of, am I going to get a ticket? Am I going to get into trouble unnecessarily? And so, in a way, this is an extra comfort feature for the driver as well as a safety feature. They can be more relaxed. So I think that as the systems become more prevalent, as it spreads through the European marketplace, I think even the manufacturers like BMW, who clearly don't like the system that much, will get used to it.
Really interesting. Stephanie, we haven't forgotten about you. What kind of lessons do you think the US or other countries can learn from the EU's experience regulating safety features like ISA?
Yeah, I could talk about this for a long time, but I will keep my answers short, as I know that we're tight on time. But I was involved in the development of ISA for the technical specification part, so from 2018 till 2021 time, through our trade association, but also through as TomTom individually. And I would probably summarize, or kind of just stick to 3 kind of main points. I think the first one is strive for a performance target that will improve road safety and will lead to high user acceptance, but it is an achievable performance rate. So there was a big discussion in Europe, as kind of David was kind of alluding to before, about what is the correctness level the system needs to reach. And there are some organizations saying, okay, it needs to be 99% correct, meaning you have a 1% failure rate. And then there were some organizations that were saying, no, it should be 65, 70% correct most of the time. And then in the end, the European Commission agreed on 90, which I think was a very fair rate to settle on, because it will have a significant impact safety-wise, but that's also achievable. And we had all the evidence to show that when you fuse the input from a camera and a map together, you can reach 90% easily. So that's the one thing I would say is, don't, for other countries looking at the regulation, think, oh, can we lower the threshold that the Europeans had set? I would encourage to stick to the 90% or go slightly higher. There was logic behind why I went for the 90, so I'd encourage that to be repeated. I think the devil's in the detail with a lot of these things. So, don't just focus on the performance requirements, but focus on how are you going to test the system? How are you going to show compliance? Because one thing is kind of saying this is how we want the system to perform, and another thing is how you actually get the car makers to demonstrate they are reaching those requirements. So again, the EU regulation kind of has a pretty good framework of how to do that testing, where you've got to make sure that there are no loopholes possibly that you could exploit to kind of bypass anything. And then my third point would be, don't reinvent the wheel. If you're a country considering, having an ISA regulation, you don't need to start from scratch, because you can look at the European ISA regulation as a starting point and then adapt it for your own national case. The Europeans have done a lot of the work, and I think they would hope, like what we saw privacy legislation with GDPR, a lot of countries countries just kind of took the framework and then kind of adapted and tweaked it for its national context. And you can do it as well, you know, so take the European ISA as a base and then adapt it for your kind of local context. That'll be my kind of main lessons learned.
Great points. David, I'm going to come back to you here. What do you think successful collaboration looks like when it comes to regulating ADAS and AV technologies on a more global scale? And are there any successful examples of that?
Well, that's a good question. And it comes back a bit to the role of NCAPs, is that in a way, the successful model of vehicle regulation over the last 40 years has been this combination of demand pull and regulatory push. And NCAPs have been very important in the demand pull side of it because they've empowered consumers to be more informed, asking manufacturers the right questions. And then related to all that, there's all the sort of soft marketing media coverage, you know, which raises awareness. That's created opportunities for manufacturers to showcase the best that they can do. But and then very often what happens, one of the challenges in the automotive sector is that the innovation and fitment of new technologies occurs in the more luxury end vehicles, where obviously the manufacturers have more scope to offer technologies and more, let's say, more affluent customers who are perhaps more ready to pay. And that's fine at the beginning stages, but you reach a point where there's a classic kind of market failure, where in the smaller vehicle classes, which are much more price competitive, you can get stuck where technologies just don't penetrate further. And that's the classic case where you need to regulate, because by regulating, you create a level playing field where all manufacturers have to do it. And you pretty quickly find that the economies of scale, particularly the more global you can make it, if you can have technologies across very large regions or preferably even right across the world, then in fact, the unit costs of doing this come tumbling down. So there's a very positive a sort of upward spiral if you get regulation at the right time in this way, creating a level playing field. But with the NCAPs play an important role as kind of pioneers of the technology and encouraging penetration. And we've seen that in many. One of the earlier ADAS system was electronic stability control, which really developed over the last 20 years. It was sort of, well, it was innovated in the 1990s, but became a strong feature in the market over the last 20 years. And in each case, you'll see that NCAPs included electronic stability control in their ratings ahead of regulation. And they created a kind of demand curve for it. And I think we'll see the same with all of these systems. So there's quite an interesting sort of ecosystem at work there. And I think NCAPs, in a way, they're not well understood as being as powerful as they are in doing that. Coming back to this sort of partnership model, what you actually want is governments and NCAPs, and very often NCAPs involve governments anyway, working together to kind of stretch the dynamic of the market and encourage. There's always a certain amount of push and pull going on with manufacturers, because those that are pioneers in technology are obviously happy to lead. Others sometimes a bit more reluctant because of the kind of cost pressures they face. But in the end, the interaction of everything I've described sort of works out, and which is why if you look in the past, we've seen very significant gains in aspects of vehicle safety through that kind of dynamic. And I see no reason it'll be different with this.
Absolutely. I'm going to stick with you for this next question, David. At PAVE, our focus is really educating the public on emerging vehicle safety technologies. How do you feel like we can best educate the public on ADAS and other safety standards, and how do you think that impacts safety in the long run?
I think it's very, very important, and we do have problems. There's a quite basic challenge, I think, in the automotive sector to do with their retail distribution, which is, I mean, typically if you go and buy a vehicle these days in a car showroom, the experts you will meet will all be about the financing of it. If you ask them about technology, very often they're completely blank. And I've played games going into car showrooms asking them to explain the technology and finding that they just couldn't do it. So I think there's a huge challenge to the automotive sector to improve the quality at point of sale in understanding, helping the consumer understand all these technologies. That could be a great partnership, by the way, with PAVE to get the car retail system to kind of respond to this. It's also an opportunity for NCAPs, because NCAPs are an independent voice that kind of rate and assess the benefits of these systems. And we've got to avoid, which there is a risk of this, of consumer skepticism or confusion, meaning that they kind of, well, we just don't want this. It's all too complicated. If it's not explained well, then they may, if they have the option, they may switch it off and so on, and not realize the benefits that the systems in the vehicle have. And that would be a huge mistake, huge lost opportunity. So I think what you're talking about is a critical task over the next decade or so, and we've seen also the risks of it being done inappropriately. I mean, the whole problems with autopilot and people thinking that a vehicle is more autonomous than it actually is, and so on. So you can see the challenge here is really quite complex. My particular concern is it's been difficult for the reasons I described, difficult to get customers to understand really basic systems. And one of the problems, we had this with electronic stability control, was manufacturers refusing to use a common name. They all wanted to brand the name. The irony was these products were actually produced by the supplier sector, but they all wanted to call them their own proprietorial names. And so instead of saying, yes, every vehicle has electronic stability control, isn't that great? Like we all know they have steering wheels. They wanted to call it, I'm coming up with names like Honda Assist or Toyota this or BMW that. And that actually adds to confusion. And so I think getting an agreement around some generic names and basic descriptions is a very important part of consumer education. So I think it's a massive challenge that we all face, and kind of mission critical, to be honest, if we're going to achieve the gains that we want.
Great points. I think you bring up a lot of critical issues that we're talking about at PAVE today. Totally agree. Stephanie, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the public perception of ISA regulations in the EU and what your perspective is on public education for ADAS features on a larger scale.
Yeah, I think David's covered some of these points quite nicely in his previous answers, but I would love to know, if we ran a survey of a sample of consumers across the EU, how many are aware of this new ISA mandate? What would the result look like? How many drivers that are about to buy a car or have just purchased a car know that ISA is now actually a technology that's mandated? So we always have, I think, this trouble, and this is probably not unique to Europe. It's probably in many countries around the world that you come up with these speeches and you've got to kind of spread the news down, towards the vast public. We had a lot of media attention actually around the 7th of July in Europe, because this was the key date in which all new vehicles sold in the EU had to be fitted with ISA. So the press were very good actually at writing a lot of articles about, okay, what is ISA? And if you buy a vehicle, it's going to have this technology. So I think the media were very much aware that this was happening. They had a lot of coverage. From the articles that I was reading that were kind of written in English, or I could, in French that I could understand, they were explaining the safety benefits. They were quite positive, but they all had a big section of how can you turn it off, which I found that, a bit kind of like, oh, okay, this is missing the point. But I think the public perception is we're going to see this in the coming years, I think, when you have the 90% performance target systems more widely used. So we've had ISA already, in cars for a number of years, but they were more basic systems, if I call it like that, weren't reaching the 90%. So we'll have to see in the coming period, basically, how that kind of changes. But so far it is quite positive. But I do agree with David that the public education part is super important. And in my opinion, I think it's insufficient. I think it's something that we need to kind of really kind of scale up if we're going to have kind of success of drivers keeping the systems on and not turning them off,
Definitely agree. Something that we need to continue working on. I have a few more questions, but unfortunately we are out of time. Stephanie, Giovanni, and David, thank you all so much for your time today and your insights. This has been a really great conversation. For our listeners, we will be posting the full recording on YouTube later today. So follow us on social media at PAVE Campaign to see that as soon as it's released, or you can check our website, pavecampaign.org. Thank you so much to everybody who attended and who submitted questions ahead of time. We so appreciate your participation.